On November the 13th, 2000, 35-year-old businessman Dariusz Janiszewski left his advertising office in Poland after receiving a phone call from a potential client. The caller insisted on speaking to him alone. It sounded routine. Janiszewski told co-workers he'd be back shortly. He never returned. At first, there was nothing obviously sinister about his disappearance. Dariusz was well liked, financially stable, and had no known enemies. Friends described him as a dependable, calm, and deeply devoted to his family. But within weeks, investigators would discover that he had vanished into one of the most psychologically bizarre murder cases in modern criminal history. This is True Crime with Emma, and feel free to follow me on my podcast on Spotify or Apple, or watch on YouTube and TikTok. Just search for True Crime with Emma. This is the case of Amok. Nearly a month after Dariusz's disappearance, fishermen along the freezing Oder River made a horrifying discovery. A male body floated near the riverbank, tangled in reeds and debris. It was Dariusz Janiszewski. To police, it sounded routine. However, the condition of the corpse immediately disturbed the investigators. His hands had been tied behind his back. A rope connected his wrists to a noose around his neck in what forensic examiners called a backward cradle. Any movement tightened the ligature further around his throat. There were signs of prolonged torture. Police believe Dariusz had likely been abducted, restrained, interrogated, and eventually thrown alive into the water. And yet, despite the brutality of the murder, detectives had almost nothing to work with. No eyewitnesses, no obvious motive, no murder weapon, ransom demand, or suspects. The investigation stalled almost immediately. For years, the murder became known in Poland as the perfect crime. But the killer had made one mistake. Not during the murder, after it. He wrote a novel. 3 years after Dariusz's death, a little-known Polish philosophy graduate and amateur writer named Krystian Bala self-published a bizarre experimental novel titled Amok. The book was nihilistic, sexually graphic, deeply philosophical, and filled with violent imagery. Its narrator, a detached intellectual named Chris, drifted through a world of alcohol, sex, cruelty, and existential emptiness. Very few people read it, at least initially, but buried inside the novel was a murder scene that felt disturbingly specific. A man is kidnapped, restrained, humiliated, killed using ropes, then discarded. To most readers, it looked like edgy fiction. To one detective, it looked like a confession. That detective was Inspector Jacques Wróblewski. Years into the cold case, Wróblewski received a tip suggesting similarities between the novel and the unsolved Janiszewski murder. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, but then he kept reading. The similarities became impossible to ignore. Certain details in the book mirrored facts from the real investigation that had never been released publicly. Details only investigators or the killer should have known. Wróblewski became obsessed. Who exactly was Krystian Bala? The answer unsettled him. Bala wasn't simply an eccentric novelist. He was highly intelligent, a philosophy graduate, a traveller, a photographer, a man fascinated by ideas around morality, superiority, and human freedom. Friends described him as charismatic but deeply manipulative. Others described him as emotionally cold, narcissistic, and obsessed with domination. Friends recalled his ability to dominate conversations, charm strangers, and blur the line between truth and invention. He would spin elaborate stories about himself that were often impossible to verify. He drank heavily, travelled widely, and seemed captivated by the idea that identity itself was a performance. To some, he was exciting, intellectual. To others, an arrogant narcissist, intoxicated by his own ideas. And then investigators discovered something even more damaging. Shortly after Dariush's disappearance, someone had sold the victim's missing cell phone on an online auction site. The account used to sell it belonged to Krystian Bala. Suddenly, the coincidence surrounding the novel no longer looked accidental. Detectives dug deeper into Bala's personal life. What they uncovered pointed towards jealousy. At the time of the murder, Bala's marriage was collapsing. He had become intensely paranoid and possessive regarding his wife. As his marriage deteriorated, the darker aspects of his personality became harder to ignore. Jealousy, possessiveness, and an obsessive need for control began to emerge. Investigators later learned he had hired a private investigator to follow her movements. Eventually, Bala became convinced she had gone on a date with Dariush. Whether the relationship between Dariush and Bala's wife was romantic, casual, or even significant remains unclear. But to Bala, it may have represented humiliation. And humiliation, according to prosecutors, became the motive for murder. His jealousy led him to plan the abduction of Dariush. With the help of an accomplice, he set up a fake meeting outside of Dariush's office. Witnesses saw Dariush approach two men who were waiting outside. He then left with them. What happened after that meeting is not fully known. They believe Bala organised the kidnapping and murder, but the exact roles of everyone involved were never completely established. Weeks later, Dariush's body was found in the river. He was restrained with a noose around his neck that tightened every time he moved. Evidence suggests that Dariush was tortured, humiliated, and starved days before his death. The more police investigated Bala, the stranger the case became. They discovered Bala had spent years travelling through Asia after the killing, drifting between countries while obsessively following media coverage of the murder. Investigators later realised that visits to a Polish crime investigation website discussing the Janaszewski case had originated from countries Bala was travelling through at the exact same time. To detectives, it looked like the killer couldn't stop revisiting his own crime. Then came the most chilling revelation of all. According to later reports, investigators searching Bala's computer allegedly found indications that he had been outlining ideas for another killing, potentially as material for a second novel. The line between fiction and reality had completely collapsed. In September 2005, 5 years after the murder, police finally arrested Krystian Bala. He denied everything. He insisted the novel was fictional, claimed the similarities were either coincidence or inspired by publicly available information. As for the victim's cell phone, he claimed he had simply found it and resold it online. But prosecutors believe Bala had made a fatal psychological error. He couldn't resist inserting himself into the narrative. At trial, the prosecution argued Bala viewed himself as intellectually superior to both police and society itself. They portrayed him as a man who believed he had committed the perfect murder, then grew arrogant enough to immortalise it in literature. The defence attacked the case as dangerously circumstantial. There was no DNA directly tying Bala to the killing, no eyewitnesses to the murder itself, no filmed confession, no recovered murder scene, but the prosecutors carefully assembled the pattern: the victim's phone, the jealous motive, the novel, the hidden details, the online obsession with the investigation, the violent fantasies. Separately, each piece looked ambiguous. Together, they painted something far darker. In 2007, Krystian Bala was convicted of planning and orchestrating the murder of Dariusz Janaszewski. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Even after conviction, Bala maintained his innocence. Supporters argued the case represented a terrifying precedent, punishing an author for fictional writing. Others believed the novel functioned as something closer to a psychological trophy, a coded confession hidden in plain sight. The case exploded internationally. Journalists compared Bala to fictional killers from crime thrillers. The murder inspired documentaries, podcasts, and eventually the 2018 film Dark Crimes, starring Jim Carrey. But beneath the surreal literary angle lies something much more disturbing. The Amok case wasn't really about a book. It was about ego, control, humiliation, and the terrifying possibility that some killers don't merely want to escape punishment, they want recognition. Because for many murderers, the crime itself is not the end of the fantasy, it is only the beginning. This has been True Crime with Emma, and if you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, and press the notification button so you can join us next time.